Margaret Chen had always believed that extraordinary things happen to extraordinary people. At 42, she considered herself decidedly ordinary. She worked as a night shift nurse at St. Mary's Hospital in downtown Chicago, drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic that rattled when she turned left, and lived in a modest apartment with her rescue cat, Mr. Whiskers. Her biggest excitement usually came from finding a good sale at the grocery store or watching her favorite medical drama reruns. The morning that would change her life forever started like any other. Margaret had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift, dealing with everything from heart attacks to broken bones. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her hair was escaping from its ponytail, and she had that particular exhaustion that comes from being on your feet all night. As she walked through the hospital lobby, she noticed a commotion near the information desk. A crowd had gathered around a woman in an expensive suit who was speaking animatedly into a microphone. Margaret recognized her as Dr. Sarah Williams, the hospital's chief administrator, someone who usually stayed locked away in the executive offices on the top floor. Margaret had seen her maybe 3 times in her 8 years of working at the hospital. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Williams was saying, her voice carrying across the marble lobby, "I'm thrilled to announce that St. Mary's Hospital has been selected to participate in a groundbreaking federal initiative. The National Healthcare Excellence Program is looking for exceptional healthcare workers to undergo specialized training that could revolutionize how we deliver patient care." Margaret paused, curious despite her tiredness. She had heard whispers about some new government program, but, like most floor staff, she assumed it would only involve doctors and administrators. Nurses, especially night shift nurses like herself, were rarely included in such high-profile initiatives. Dr. Williams continued, "We're looking for candidates who demonstrate not just clinical excellence, but also innovation, dedication, and the ability to think outside conventional medical frameworks. The selected individuals will undergo intensive training in Washington, D.C., working directly with federal health officials and, potentially advising on national healthcare policy." A doctor near Margaret scoffed quietly. "Sounds like another bureaucratic waste of time," he muttered to his colleague. "Probably just want to look good for the cameras." Margaret found herself lingering, even though her tired feet were begging her to go home. There was something about the way Dr. Williams spoke that suggested this was bigger than the usual administrative initiatives that came and went like hospital cafeteria menu changes. "Applications are due by Friday," Dr. Williams announced. "We encourage all qualified staff members to apply. This is an opportunity to not just advance your career, but to genuinely impact healthcare on a national level." As the crowd dispersed, Margaret noticed the application packets stacked on a nearby table. Almost without thinking, she picked one up. The cover page was impressive, with official government seals and dense paragraphs about transformative healthcare delivery and innovative patient care paradigms. On her drive home, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the announcement. At red lights, she found herself glancing at the application packet sitting on her passenger seat. It seemed almost laughable that someone like her would even consider applying. She wasn't a doctor or a researcher. She didn't have advanced degrees or published papers. She was just a nurse who showed up every night, did her job, and went home. But, as she sat in her apartment later that morning, still in her scrubs and nursing a cup of coffee, Margaret found herself actually reading through the application materials. The requirements were surprisingly broad. They wanted healthcare professionals with demonstrated excellence in patient care, innovative problem-solving abilities, and commitment to healthcare improvement. There was no requirement for specific degrees or positions. Margaret thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly patient she had cared for last month. The woman had been admitted with complications from diabetes, but Margaret had noticed she seemed confused about her medication schedule. Instead of just following the standard protocol, Margaret had spent extra time with her, creating a simple visual chart that helped Mrs. Rodriguez understand exactly when and how to take her medications. The woman's condition had improved dramatically, and she had been discharged days earlier than expected. Or there was the time Margaret had suggested a small change to the way they positioned patients during certain procedures, based on something she had observed during her years of night shifts. The modification had been adopted hospital-wide and had reduced patient discomfort significantly. Maybe, Margaret thought, ordinary people could do extraordinary things. Maybe the fact that she worked closely with patients every single day, that she saw healthcare from the ground level, could actually be valuable. She spent the rest of the week working on her application between shifts. She wrote about her experiences, her observations, and her ideas for improving patient care. She tried to articulate things she had never put into words before, like how the quiet hours of night shifts had taught her to really listen to patients, or how working with limited resources had forced her to become creative in finding solutions. When Friday arrived, Margaret stood outside Dr. Williams' office, holding her completed application. Her hands were slightly shaky, and she had changed her clothes 3 times that morning, settling on her least wrinkled professional outfit. The secretary, a stern-looking woman who had worked at the hospital longer than anyone could remember, barely looked up when Margaret approached. "I'd like to submit an application for the National Healthcare Excellence Program," Margaret said, her voice sounding smaller than she intended. The secretary glanced at her with obvious surprise. "Are you a doctor?" "No, I'm a registered nurse. Night shift in the cardiac unit." The woman's expression clearly conveyed her opinion that Margaret was wasting everyone's time. "I suppose I can take it," she said with a sigh, as if accepting Margaret's application was a personal inconvenience. Margaret handed over her carefully prepared packet and left quickly, her face burning with embarrassment. As she walked back toward the elevators, she heard the secretary's voice carrying through the open office door. "Dr. Williams, we have another one of those applications from the floor staff. A night nurse this time. Should I even bother processing it?" Margaret didn't wait to hear the response. She pressed the elevator button repeatedly, desperate to escape before anyone else could witness her apparent presumption in applying for something so clearly above her station. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret tried to put the application out of her mind. She threw herself into her work with renewed focus, as if proving to herself that her regular job was enough, that she didn't need to reach for anything bigger. But, late at night, during the quiet hours when she was charting medications or checking on sleeping patients, her mind would drift to the possibility that something might come of her application. Her co-workers had mixed reactions when she mentioned what she had done. Some were supportive, saying it was worth a try. Others were more skeptical. "Margaret, you know these programs are really for the doctors and administrators," said Linda, a fellow nurse who had been at the hospital even longer than Margaret. "They just say they want everyone to apply to look inclusive. They've probably already decided who they want." James, one of the younger nurses, was more encouraging. "I think it's cool that you went for it. Even if nothing happens, at least you tried." But it was Dr. Peterson, one of the cardiac surgeons, who delivered the most cutting assessment. Margaret overheard him talking to another doctor near the nurses' station one evening. "I heard some of the nurses applied for that federal program," he said with a laugh. "Can you imagine? They probably think watching medical dramas qualifies them for healthcare policy work." His colleague chuckled. "Well, someone has to have delusions of grandeur. Keeps them motivated, I suppose." Margaret felt her cheeks burn as she pretended to be absorbed in her patient charts. She told herself it didn't matter what they thought, but their words stung more than she wanted to admit. 3 weeks after submitting her application, Margaret had almost convinced herself to forget about the whole thing. She was finishing up her shift on a Tuesday morning when her supervisor, Carol, approached her with an unusual expression. "Margaret, there's someone from administration looking for you," Carol said, her voice carefully neutral. "They're waiting in conference room B." Margaret's heart started beating faster. In 8 years of working at the hospital, she had never been called to meet with anyone from administration. Her first thought was that she was in trouble for something, though she couldn't imagine what. She made her way to the conference room, her mind racing through recent events, trying to figure out what might have warranted administrative attention. Had she made an error in patient care? Violated some policy she wasn't aware of? When she knocked on the conference room door, a voice called for her to enter. Inside, she found Dr. Williams sitting at the table with a man in a dark suit whom Margaret didn't recognize. Both looked serious, which did nothing to calm her nerves. "Margaret, please sit down," Dr. Williams said, gesturing to a chair across from them. "This is Mr. Davidson from the Department of Health and Human Services." Margaret sat down carefully, her hands folded in her lap, trying to project professionalism despite feeling completely out of her element. Mr. Davidson smiled, which was reassuring. "Ms. Chan, I'm here because of your application to the National Healthcare Excellence Program. I have to say, your submission was quite impressive." Margaret blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your application," he repeated. "The review committee was particularly struck by your insights into patient care delivery and your practical suggestions for system improvements. The way you described your experience implementing informal quality improvements on your unit showed exactly the kind of innovative thinking we're looking for." Margaret looked between Mr. Davidson and Dr. Williams, still not quite believing what she was hearing. Dr. Williams looked as surprised as Margaret felt. "We'd like to invite you to participate in the program," Mr. Davidson continued. "You would spend 6 weeks in Washington, D.C., working with our healthcare policy team and contributing to the development of new national guidelines for patient care standards." The room seemed to spin slightly. Margaret gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what she was hearing. I don't understand," she managed. "There must be some mistake. I'm just a night shift nurse." Mr. Davidson leaned forward. "Ms. Chen, some of the most important innovations in healthcare have come from people who work directly with patients every day. Your perspective is exactly what we need to make sure our policies actually work in the real world." Dr. Williams cleared her throat. "Margaret, this is an extraordinary opportunity. The hospital will provide you with paid leave to participate, and your position will be held for you when you return." Margaret felt like she was in a dream. 3 weeks ago, she had been embarrassed by the secretary's dismissive attitude toward her application. Now, a federal official was telling her that her insights were valuable enough to inform national healthcare policy. "When would this start?" she asked, her voice still shaky with disbelief. 2 weeks from Monday," Mr. Davidson replied. "We'll arrange for your travel and accommodation. You'll be working directly with our senior policy team, and there will be opportunities to present your findings to healthcare leaders from across the country." As Margaret left the conference room 20 minutes later, her head was spinning with information about travel arrangements, program schedules, and security clearance procedures. She walked through the hospital hallways in a daze, hardly able to believe what had just happened. When she reached the nurses' station, she found herself surrounded by curious colleagues who had heard rumors about the mysterious meeting. "So what was that about?" Linda asked immediately. Margaret took a deep breath, still processing everything herself. "They accepted me for the federal healthcare program. I'm going to Washington, D.C. for 6 weeks. The reaction was immediate and varied. Some of her colleagues congratulated her enthusiastically, while others looked skeptical or surprised. Margaret could practically see the wheels turning in their heads as they tried to reconcile the ordinary Margaret they knew with someone who had been selected for a prestigious federal program. Dr. Peterson happened to be at the nurses' station when Margaret made her announcement. He looked up from the chart he was reviewing, his expression clearly doubtful. "You're going to Washington for a healthcare policy program?" he asked, his tone suggesting he found the idea absurd. "Yes," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I start in 2 weeks." He exchanged a look with the resident standing next to him. "Well," he said with a condescending smile, "I suppose they need someone to take notes." Margaret felt the familiar burn of embarrassment and anger, but this time it was different. This time, she had proof that her perspective had value, that her experience mattered. She looked Dr. Peterson directly in the eye. "Actually, they want my input on developing new patient care standards," she said calmly. "They think my frontline experience gives me insights that might be valuable for policy development." Dr. Peterson's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Well, good luck with that," he said dismissively, returning to his chart. As Margaret finished her shift that morning, she reflected on how much her world had changed in a single conversation. Tomorrow, she would start preparing for an adventure she never could have imagined. In 2 weeks, she would be in the nation's capital, contributing to healthcare policy discussions that could affect millions of patients. The ordinary woman who had been mocked for her presumption in applying was about to become something she had never thought possible, someone whose voice mattered on a national stage. But, as she drove home that morning, Margaret had no idea that her journey to Washington would lead to an encounter that would change not just her own life, but, potentially, the lives of countless others. The first phase of her transformation was complete. Margaret Chen was no longer just a night shift nurse from Chicago. She was a federal healthcare policy consultant, chosen for her unique perspective and innovative thinking. But the real test of her abilities, and the moment that would define her future, was still to come. Margaret's first morning in Washington, D.C. felt like stepping into a different universe. She stood in front of the imposing glass building that housed the Department of Health and Human Services, clutching her briefcase and trying to calm her racing heart. The building seemed to stretch endlessly upward, its windows reflecting the early morning sun like a giant mirror. People in expensive suits streamed past her, all looking confident and purposeful, speaking into phones about budgets and policies and meetings with people whose names Margaret recognized from news broadcasts. She checked her reflection in the building's glass doors one more time. Her outfit, a navy blue suit she had bought specifically for this trip, felt foreign on her body. At the hospital, she wore scrubs that prioritized comfort and functionality. This suit, while professional, made her feel like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. The security checkpoint inside was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. Guards examined her identification with military precision, scanned her belongings, and issued her a temporary badge with her photo looking strangely serious and official. The badge read Margaret Chen, Healthcare Policy Consultant, and seeing those words made her stomach flip with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Mr. Davidson met her in the lobby, looking exactly as polished and professional as he had during their meeting in Chicago. But his warm smile helped ease some of Margaret's nervousness. "Margaret, welcome to Washington," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "Ready for an adventure?" The elevator ride to the 15th floor was silent except for the soft classical music playing overhead. Margaret watched the floor numbers tick by, each one taking her further from the familiar world of patient care and deeper into the realm of federal policy. When the doors opened, she was greeted by a hallway lined with photographs of government officials and framed certificates that spoke of achievements and recognition she could barely comprehend. "Your office is just down here," Mr. Davidson said, leading her past doors marked with titles like Director of Health Policy Implementation and Senior Advisor for Clinical Standards. Margaret wondered what her own door would say, assuming she even got one. To her surprise, she did. A small office with her name printed on a nameplate, Margaret Chen, Healthcare Policy Consultant. Inside was a desk, a computer, a bookshelf filled with policy manuals, and a window that looked out over the bustling streets of the nation's capital. "This is incredible," Margaret said, running her fingers along the edge of her new desk. "I can't believe this is real." Mr. Davidson checked his watch. "The orientation meeting starts in 30 minutes. You'll be meeting the other program participants and getting an overview of your assignments for the next 6 weeks." As they walked toward the conference room, Margaret tried to prepare herself mentally for meeting her fellow participants. She imagined they would be doctors, researchers, and administrators, people with advanced degrees and impressive titles. She rehearsed introductions in her head, trying to figure out how to present herself without sounding insignificant. The conference room was already filled with about 20 people when they arrived. Margaret's prediction proved largely accurate. She overheard conversations about research studies, medical school experiences, and administrative challenges at major hospital systems. The participants were an impressive group, and Margaret felt increasingly out of place as she listened to their credentials and accomplishments. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the program director, called the meeting to order. She was an elegant woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. "Welcome, everyone, to the National Healthcare Excellence Program," she began. "Each of you was selected because you bring a unique perspective to healthcare policy development. Over the next 6 weeks, you'll be working on critical initiatives that will directly impact how healthcare is delivered across the country." Margaret tried to focus on Dr. Martinez's words, but she was distracted by the other participants around the table. To her left sat Dr. Jonathan Wright, a cardiac surgeon from Johns Hopkins who had published extensively on surgical innovations. To her right was Dr. Sarah Kim, a health administration PhD who had advised 3 different state governments on healthcare reform. When Dr. Martinez asked everyone to introduce themselves, Margaret's anxiety spiked. One by one, the participants shared their impressive backgrounds. Dr. Wright discussed his research on minimally invasive cardiac procedures. Dr. Kim outlined her experience with healthcare economics. A man named Dr. Thompson described his work developing telemedicine programs for rural communities. When Margaret's turn came, the room fell silent, and she felt 20 pairs of eyes focused on her. Her mouth felt dry as she began to speak. I'm Margaret Chen. I'm a registered nurse from St. Mary's Hospital in Chicago. I work night shifts in the cardiac unit, and I've been there for 8 years. She paused, suddenly, aware of how simple her background sounded compared to everyone else's elaborate credentials. But she forced herself to continue. I applied for this program because I believe that the people who spend the most time directly caring for patients might have insights that could help improve healthcare policy. When she finished, there was a moment of polite silence before Dr. Martinez moved on to the next participant. Margaret caught a few subtle glances exchanged between some of the other participants, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. During the break, Margaret found herself standing alone by the coffee station while clusters of participants engaged in animated discussions about research methodologies and policy frameworks. She overheard Dr. Wright talking to a group near the window. It's interesting that they're including frontline staff, he said, his voice carrying just enough for Margaret to hear. Though I'm not sure how much clinical nursing experience translates to federal policy work. Another voice, which Margaret recognized as Dr. Kim's, responded quietly, I suppose they need different perspectives, even if they're not academic. Margaret poured her coffee with trembling hands, trying to act as if she hadn't heard the conversation. She had expected some degree of skepticism, but hearing it voiced so casually still stung. The afternoon session focused on their first major assignment. Dr. Martinez explained that they would be divided into teams to analyze current healthcare delivery challenges and propose policy solutions. The teams would present their findings to senior health officials at the end of the second week. Margaret, Dr. Martinez said, consulting her notes, you'll be working with Dr. Wright, Dr. Kim, and Dr. Thompson on patient care standardization across different healthcare settings. Margaret felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. Of all the possible team combinations, she had been assigned to work with the very people she had overheard discussing her qualifications. As the meeting concluded, her new teammates approached her with professional smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Margaret, Dr. Wright said, extending his hand, looking forward to working with you. Though I have to say, this might be quite different from your usual work environment. Different how? Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice even. Dr. Kim jumped in smoothly. Well, policy development requires a lot of theoretical framework analysis and statistical interpretation. It's more abstract than direct patient care. The implication was clear, they thought her practical experience wouldn't be relevant to their theoretical work. Margaret nodded politely, but, inside, she was already questioning whether she belonged in this program at all. The first week of team meetings confirmed Margaret's worst fears. Her teammates, while never openly rude, consistently treated her contributions as secondary to their own. When she suggested that policy recommendations should account for the practical realities of implementation on hospital floors, Dr. Wright would nod politely and, then, redirect the conversation to research studies and theoretical models. During one particularly frustrating session, Margaret tried to explain how a proposed patient monitoring protocol would be nearly impossible to implement during busy night shifts when nurses often had to care for twice as many patients as recommended. That's an interesting observation, Margaret, Dr. Thompson said in the tone one might use with a child, but policy development has to focus on optimal standards, not current limitations. But, if the standards are impossible to implement in real-world conditions, won't they just be ignored? Margaret countered. Dr. Kim looked up from her laptop with a patronizing smile. That's why we have implementation phases and training programs. The goal is to change current practices, not accommodate their limitations. Margaret felt like she was speaking a different language. She understood the importance of setting high standards, but her 8 years of night shifts had taught her the difference between theoretical ideals and practical reality. Patients needed care that actually worked in real hospitals with real constraints, not just policies that looked good on paper. By the end of the first week, Margaret was seriously considering asking to be removed from the program. She spent her evenings alone in her hotel room, calling home and talking to Mr. Whiskers through video chat, questioning every decision that had brought her to Washington. The second week brought a new challenge. Dr. Martinez announced that each team would present their preliminary findings to Deputy Secretary Williams, the second highest official in the Department of Health and Human Services. "This is your opportunity to make a real impact," Dr. Martinez explained. Deputy Secretary Williams is directly involved in policy implementation, and your recommendations could influence national healthcare standards. Margaret's teammates immediately assigned her the role of preparing visual aids and taking notes during their presentation. When she suggested that she might contribute to the actual content, Dr. Wright shook his head. "Margaret, we appreciate your input, but this presentation needs to be grounded in research and policy analysis. Why don't you focus on making sure our slides look professional?" The dismissal was gentle but absolute. Margaret spent the next 2 days creating PowerPoint presentations while her teammates developed policy recommendations that completely ignored the practical insights she had tried to contribute. The morning of their presentation, Margaret sat in the back of the conference room while her teammates presented their findings to Deputy Secretary Williams and several other high-ranking officials. Their recommendations were academically sound and theoretically elegant, but Margaret could see dozens of practical problems that would prevent successful implementation. When Deputy Secretary Williams asked questions about real-world application, Margaret's teammates struggled to provide concrete answers. Dr. Wright talked about optimization through training initiatives, while Dr. Kim referenced implementation science methodologies. Their responses were filled with buzzwords but lacking in practical detail. Margaret watched the officials' faces as they listened to these vague explanations. Deputy Secretary Williams, in particular, seemed increasingly skeptical as the presentation continued. Finally, she interrupted. "These recommendations sound impressive, but I'm concerned about practical implementation. How would these policies actually work in a busy urban hospital at 3 in the morning?" Dr. Wright and Dr. Kim exchanged glances before launching into another round of theoretical explanations. Margaret felt her frustration building as she watched her teammates fail to address the Deputy Secretary's very practical concerns. Without really thinking about it, Margaret found herself raising her hand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "If I may?" The room turned to look at her, and Margaret felt her heart racing. Deputy Secretary Williams nodded encouragingly. "The policy recommendations are excellent in theory," Margaret began, "but there are some practical challenges that would prevent successful implementation." She stood up, moving to the front of the room despite the shocked expressions on her teammates' faces. For example, the proposed patient monitoring protocol requires nurses to complete assessments every 2 hours. In most urban hospitals during night shifts, nurses typically care for 8 to 12 patients. Completing comprehensive assessments for that many patients every 2 hours would mean spending the entire shift just on paperwork, leaving no time for actual patient care. Deputy Secretary Williams leaned forward, clearly interested. "What would you suggest instead?" Margaret felt a surge of confidence as she realized that someone in authority was actually listening to her practical perspective. A modified approach that uses digital monitoring for stable patients and focuses intensive assessments on high-risk cases. This would maintain patient safety while remaining feasible for real-world implementation. She continued for several more minutes, explaining specific modifications that would address the implementation challenges her teammates had ignored. The room was completely silent as she spoke, and Margaret could see Deputy Secretary Williams taking detailed notes. When she finished, Deputy Secretary Williams looked impressed. "Ms. Chen, your insights are exactly what we need. Too often, policies are developed without consideration for real-world implementation constraints." Margaret returned to her seat, aware that her teammates were staring at her with expressions of shock and something that might have been resentment. She had just contradicted their carefully prepared presentation, but, more importantly, she had demonstrated the value of her practical experience in ways they couldn't ignore. After the meeting, Deputy Secretary Williams approached Margaret privately. "Miss Chen, I'd like you to prepare a detailed analysis of implementation challenges for all the policy recommendations being developed by the program participants. Your perspective is invaluable." As Margaret left the building that evening, she felt like she was finally beginning to understand why she had been selected for this program. Her value wasn't in competing with the doctors and researchers on their own terms, it was in bringing a perspective that they simply couldn't provide. But she had no idea that her growing reputation within the department was about to bring her to the attention of someone far more powerful than Deputy Secretary Williams. The ordinary nurse from Chicago was about to become visible to people at the very highest levels of government, including one person whose attention would change everything. Margaret's third week in Washington began with an unexpected assignment that would prove to be the turning point of her entire experience. Deputy Secretary Williams called her into a private meeting on Monday morning, and Margaret found herself sitting across from one of the most powerful people in American healthcare policy. "Margaret, your analysis of the implementation challenges has been exceptional," Deputy Secretary Williams began, sliding a thick folder across her desk. "I'm assigning you to a special project that requires exactly your kind of practical insight." Margaret opened the folder to find documents marked with official seals and the words "Confidential White House Healthcare Initiative" stamped in red across the top. Her hands trembled slightly as she realized the significance of what she was being shown. "The President is developing a comprehensive healthcare reform package," Deputy Secretary Williams explained. "The policy has been drafted by some of the country's top healthcare economists and policy experts, but the White House is concerned about implementation feasibility." Margaret looked up from the documents, hardly believing what she was hearing. "You want me to review healthcare policy for the President?" "Not just review it," Deputy Secretary Williams clarified. "We want you to completely assess it from a frontline perspective. The President has specifically requested that someone with direct patient care experience evaluate whether these policies will actually work in real hospitals with real patients." The weight of the assignment hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had gone from being dismissed by her teammates to being asked to evaluate presidential healthcare policy. The ordinary nurse from Chicago was being entrusted with a task that could influence healthcare for millions of Americans. Margaret spent the next 72 hours immersed in the policy documents. She barely left her hotel room, ordering room service and working through meals as she analyzed hundreds of pages of proposed regulations, funding mechanisms, and implementation timelines. The policies were brilliant in their scope and ambition, but, as Margaret read through them with her practical nurse's perspective, she began to see numerous potential problems. The proposed nurse-to-patient ratios, while ideal for patient safety, would require hospitals to hire nurses at a rate that was simply impossible given current nursing school graduation rates. The mandated technology upgrades would cost more than many rural hospitals could afford. The training requirements were so extensive that implementing them would require shutting down hospital units for weeks at a time. Margaret worked methodically through each section, creating detailed notes about implementation challenges and potential solutions. She drew on her 8 years of night shift experience, remembering every shortage of supplies, every understaffed shift, every moment when ideal protocols had to be adapted to real-world constraints. By Thursday morning, she had completed a comprehensive analysis that ran to 47 pages. Her report didn't just identify problems, it proposed specific modifications that would maintain the policy's beneficial goals while making them practically achievable. When she submitted her report to Deputy Secretary Williams, Margaret felt simultaneously proud of her work and terrified of its potential impact. This wasn't a theoretical exercise or a training presentation. This was policy analysis that could influence decisions affecting the entire American healthcare system. Deputy Secretary Williams called Margaret into her office that same afternoon. Her expression was serious as she held up Margaret's report. "This is extraordinary work," she said without preamble. "Your recommendations are exactly what we needed. You've identified critical implementation issues that our policy experts completely missed." Margaret felt a surge of pride, but Deputy Secretary Williams wasn't finished. "The White House wants to meet with you." Margaret's heart stopped. I'm sorry, what? Your analysis is being reviewed at the highest levels. They want you to present your findings directly to the White House healthcare policy team. Tomorrow. Margaret felt the room spinning slightly. In less than a month, she had gone from being mocked by colleagues to being summoned to the White House. It felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in movies or news stories. I don't understand, Margaret said weakly. Surely there are more qualified people to present this information. Deputy Secretary Williams leaned forward, her expression intense. Margaret, you are the qualified person. Your perspective is unique and invaluable. These policies were developed by people with impressive credentials and brilliant minds, but they lack your understanding of how healthcare actually works on the ground. That evening, Margaret called her supervisor Carol back at St. Mary's Hospital. She needed to hear a familiar voice from her regular world to help her process what was happening. Margaret, this is incredible, Carol said after Margaret explained about the White House meeting. I can't believe our night shift nurse is advising the president on healthcare policy. Carol, I'm terrified, Margaret admitted. What if I say something wrong? What if I embarrass myself in front of these important people? Margaret, Carol's voice was firm and reassuring, you know more about patient care than most of those important people ever will. You've seen what works and what doesn't work every single night for 8 years. Trust your experience. The next morning, Margaret stood outside the White House, looking up at the most famous residence in America. The security process was even more extensive than at the Department of Health and Human Services. Guards checked her identification multiple times, and she passed through several checkpoints before being escorted into the West Wing by a serious-looking aide. The Oval Office wasn't where her meeting was scheduled, but, as she walked through the corridors of power, Margaret caught glimpses of rooms she had only seen on television. Everything was more elegant and imposing than she had imagined, from the portraits of former presidents lining the walls to the thick carpets that muffled every footstep. Her meeting was in the Roosevelt Room, a formal conference room with a long polished table surrounded by leather chairs. When Margaret entered, she found herself facing 8 people in expensive suits, all looking at her with expressions of polite curiosity mixed with skepticism. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the White House Director of Healthcare Policy, made introductions. The group included senior policy advisors, economists, and implementation specialists, all people with advanced degrees and impressive titles who had devoted their careers to healthcare policy development. Ms. Chen, Dr. Morrison began, we understand you have concerns about the practical implementation of our healthcare reform package. Margaret took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had been invited here specifically because of her practical experience. These people might have more credentials, but she had something they lacked, 8 years of seeing healthcare policy translated into actual patient care. Thank you for this opportunity, Margaret began, her voice steadier than she expected. I want to start by saying that the proposed policies are ambitious and well-intentioned. However, there are several practical challenges that could prevent successful implementation. For the next hour, Margaret walked through her analysis, section by section. She explained how the proposed staffing ratios, while beneficial for patient care, would be impossible to achieve given current nursing shortages. She outlined how the mandated technology upgrades would financially devastate rural hospitals that were already struggling to stay open. She detailed how the training requirements would create temporary staffing crises that could actually harm patient care during the transition period. But Margaret didn't just identify problems. For each challenge she raised, she proposed specific solutions. Instead of mandating immediate staffing improvements, she suggested phased implementation tied to nursing school expansion programs. Rather than requiring expensive technology upgrades across all hospitals simultaneously, she recommended a tiered approach that prioritized critical care facilities while providing implementation support for smaller hospitals. As she spoke, Margaret noticed the expressions around the table shifting from polite skepticism to genuine interest. Dr. Morrison was taking detailed notes, and several of the policy advisors were asking follow-up questions that showed they were seriously considering her recommendations. When Margaret finished her presentation, the room was quiet for a moment before Dr. Morrison spoke. Ms. Chen, this analysis is remarkable. You've identified critical implementation flaws that our team completely overlooked. Your proposed solutions are both practical and achievable. One of the economists, Dr. Robert Hayes, leaned forward. I have to ask, Ms. Chen, where did you develop this level of policy analysis expertise? Your recommendations demonstrate sophisticated understanding of healthcare economics and implementation science. Margaret smiled, feeling more confident than she had since arriving in Washington. I learned it by working night shifts for 8 years, Dr. Hayes. When you're responsible for patient care with limited resources and inadequate staffing, you become very good at figuring out what works and what doesn't. The meeting concluded with Dr. Morrison asking Margaret to expand her analysis to cover additional sections of the healthcare reform package. As Margaret prepared to leave, Dr. Morrison pulled her aside privately. Ms. Chen, your work is being reviewed at the very highest levels. I want you to be prepared for the possibility that you might be asked to present these findings directly to the President. Margaret felt her knees go weak. The President? As in the actual President of the United States? Dr. Morrison nodded seriously. Your insights could significantly influence the final shape of this healthcare reform package. The President values practical input, especially from people who understand how policies affect real patients. That weekend, Margaret tried to process everything that had happened. She called her best friend Lisa back in Chicago, struggling to explain the surreal turn her life had taken. Margaret, do you realize what this means? Lisa said excitedly. You're influencing national healthcare policy. People across the country could benefit from your work. But Margaret was still grappling with the magnitude of her situation. A month ago, she had been mocked by colleagues for applying to a federal program that seemed beyond her qualifications. Now, she was potentially going to advise the President of the United States on healthcare policy. The call came on Tuesday afternoon while Margaret was in her temporary office, working on the expanded analysis Dr. Morrison had requested. Her phone rang, and, when she answered, she heard Dr. Morrison's voice. Margaret, can you be at the White House Thursday at 2 o'clock? The President would like to meet with you. Margaret's phone slipped in her sweaty palm. The President wants to meet with me? Your analysis has reached the Oval Office, and the President specifically requested a personal briefing from you. This is highly unusual, Margaret. Presidents typically receive policy briefings from senior advisors, not from individual consultants. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her office chair, staring out the window at the bustling streets of Washington, D.C. In 48 hours, she would be in the Oval Office, explaining healthcare implementation challenges to the most powerful person in the world. The ordinary nurse who had been dismissed and mocked just weeks earlier was about to become the most influential healthcare voice in the country. But, even as Margaret prepared for the meeting that would define her career, she had no idea that the President's reaction to her briefing would lead to an opportunity that would transform not just her own life, but potentially the lives of millions of Americans seeking healthcare. The stage was set for a conversation that would change everything. Margaret Chen, the night shift nurse from Chicago, was about to discover that sometimes the most ordinary people can have the most extraordinary impact. Thursday morning arrived with crisp autumn air and bright sunshine that seemed to mock Margaret's internal turmoil. She had barely slept, spending most of the night rehearsing her presentation and trying to calm her racing thoughts. At 6 a.m., she gave up on sleep entirely and spent 2 hours preparing for the most important meeting of her life. Standing in front of her hotel room mirror, Margaret practiced her opening remarks for the 100th time. She had chosen her most professional outfit, a charcoal gray suit that conveyed competence without being flashy. Her hands shook slightly as she applied lipstick, and she had to steady herself against the bathroom counter. You can do this, she told her reflection. You've been invited because your perspective matters. The President of the United States wants to hear what you have to say. The words felt surreal even as she spoke them. Margaret Chen, who 6 weeks ago had been dismissed by her own colleagues as presumptuous for applying to a federal program, was about to brief the President on healthcare policy. The White House was even more imposing the second time Margaret approached it. Security was heightened for her presidential meeting, and she was escorted through multiple checkpoints by serious-faced Secret Service agents. Each step deeper into the building felt like crossing into a more rarefied atmosphere of power and influence. Dr. Morrison met her in the West Wing corridor, looking as nervous as Margaret felt. "The president is running about 10 minutes behind schedule," she explained as they walked toward the Oval Office. "He's been studying your report since yesterday afternoon. I've never seen him spend that much time on a single policy analysis." They paused outside the most famous office in America. Margaret could see through the slightly open door to glimpses of the presidential seal in the carpet, the historic desk, and tall windows that looked out onto the south lawn. Everything she had seen in photographs and movies was there, but somehow more real and more intimidating. "Ms. Chen?" A voice came from inside the office. "Please come in." Margaret stepped into the Oval Office and found herself face to face with the President of the United States. He was taller than she had expected, with an easy smile that immediately put her somewhat at ease. He rose from behind his desk and walked over to shake her hand. "Ms. Chen, thank you for coming. I've been looking forward to this conversation." Margaret managed to respond without her voice cracking. "Thank you for this incredible opportunity, Mr. President. I'm honored to be here." The president gestured toward two chairs positioned near the fireplace. "Let's sit over here. I want this to be a conversation, not a formal briefing." As they settled into the chairs, Margaret noticed that the president had a copy of her report on the small table between them, with numerous handwritten notes in the margins. "I have to tell you, Ms. Chen, your analysis has been eye-opening," the president began. "I've received hundreds of policy briefings during my time in office, but yours is the first that made me realize we might be developing healthcare reforms that sound impressive but won't actually work for the people who need them most." Margaret felt a surge of confidence. "Mr. President, that's exactly what I hoped to convey. The proposed policies have excellent goals, but implementation in real-world healthcare settings requires understanding the constraints that frontline workers face every day." For the next 45 minutes, Margaret found herself in the most extraordinary conversation of her life. The president asked detailed questions about her specific recommendations, and Margaret discovered that he was genuinely interested in understanding the practical implications of policy decisions. When she explained how proposed staffing ratios would be impossible to achieve in most hospitals, the president leaned forward intently. "Help me understand this better," he said. "If we can't implement these ratios immediately, what's a realistic timeline that would actually improve patient care?" Margaret outlined her phased approach, explaining how gradual implementation tied to nursing education expansion could achieve the same goals without creating healthcare crises during the transition period. "That makes complete sense," the president said, making notes in the margin of her report. "Why didn't our policy team think of this approach?" "Mr. President, your policy team is brilliant, but they've been thinking about healthcare from an academic and economic perspective. I've been thinking about it from the perspective of someone who has to make it work at 3 in the morning when half the nursing staff called in sick and the hospital is at 110% capacity." The president laughed, and Margaret realized with amazement that she was actually having a normal conversation with one of the most powerful people in the world. "Ms. Chen, I need to ask you something," the president said, his tone becoming more serious. "Would you be willing to extend your time in Washington? I'd like you to work directly with my healthcare policy team to revise these reforms based on your recommendations." Margaret's heart stopped. "Work directly with your team? For how long?" "Initially, another 6 weeks to complete the policy revisions. But I have to be honest with you, if this works as well as I expect it to, I'd like you to consider a permanent position as a senior advisor for healthcare implementation." Margaret felt like she was in a dream. The President of the United States was offering her a permanent position in the White House. The ordinary nurse from Chicago was being invited to become one of the most influential healthcare voices in the country. "Mr. President, I'm incredibly honored, but I need to ask, are you sure I'm qualified for this kind of position? I don't have a policy background or advanced degrees." The president smiled. "Ms. Chen, you have something more valuable than advanced degrees. You have 8 years of experience seeing how healthcare policies actually affect patients. You understand the difference between policies that look good on paper and policies that actually work in practice." He stood up and walked to his desk, picking up a folder that Margaret hadn't noticed before. I want to show you something, he said, returning with the folder. These are letters from patients and healthcare workers across the country. People writing to tell me about problems in the healthcare system that need attention. He opened the folder and pulled out several letters, handing them to Margaret. This letter is from a nurse in rural Montana who says her hospital can't afford the technology upgrades required by new regulations. This one is from a patient in Florida whose treatment was delayed because new staffing requirements meant her hospital had to reduce available services. This letter is from a doctor in Ohio who says new protocols sound great in theory but are impossible to implement in his emergency room. Margaret read through the letters, recognizing situations similar to challenges she had faced throughout her career. Mr. President, these are exactly the kinds of implementation problems I've been seeing in policy development. Exactly, the President said. I've been receiving letters like these for months, and I finally realized that our policy development process was missing a crucial element: insight from people who actually have to implement these policies in real healthcare settings. He sat back down, looking directly at Margaret with an intensity that made her understand why he had been elected to lead the country. Ms. Chen, I believe your perspective could prevent us from making policy mistakes that would harm the very people we're trying to help. Will you help me make sure our healthcare reforms actually work for patients and healthcare workers? Margaret took a deep breath, thinking about Mrs. Rodriguez and all the other patients she had cared for over the years. She thought about the countless nights when she had struggled to provide quality care despite inadequate resources and impossible constraints. She thought about all the policies that had been implemented at her hospital that sounded good but made her job harder and patient care less effective. Mr. President, yes. I'll do whatever I can to help. The President smiled and stood up to shake her hand again. Welcome to the team, Senior Advisor Chen. As Margaret left the Oval Office an hour later, her head was spinning with the magnitude of what had just occurred. Dr. Morrison walked with her back through the West Wing corridors, barely able to contain her excitement. Margaret, do you understand what just happened? The President doesn't usually spend that much time with policy consultants, and he certainly doesn't usually offer them permanent senior advisor positions on the spot. Margaret was still processing everything. I can't believe this is real. 6 weeks ago, I was being mocked for applying to a federal program I wasn't qualified for. Now I'm a senior advisor to the President. You were always qualified, Dr. Morrison said firmly. You just had a different kind of qualification than what people expected. That evening, Margaret called her supervisor Carol to explain that she wouldn't be returning to St. Mary's Hospital as scheduled. Margaret, I have to say, we're going to miss you terribly, but this is incredible, Carol said. Do you realize that you're probably the first night shift nurse to become a senior advisor to the President? Margaret laughed, still hardly believing it herself. Carol, I keep waiting for someone to tell me this is all a mistake. It's not a mistake, Carol said firmly. You've always been exceptional at understanding how to make things work in real healthcare settings. Now you have the opportunity to use that expertise to help millions of patients across the country. Over the following weeks, Margaret threw herself into her new role with the same dedication she had brought to patient care. Working directly with the President's healthcare policy team, she helped revise the reform package to address the implementation challenges she had identified. The revised policies maintained their ambitious goals for improving patient care but included realistic timelines and support mechanisms that would make successful implementation possible. Margaret's recommendations led to the creation of implementation support programs for rural hospitals, phased staffing improvements tied to healthcare worker training initiatives, and modified technology requirements that prioritized patient safety while considering financial constraints. 3 months after Margaret had first applied to the National Healthcare Excellence Program, the President announced the final healthcare reform package in a nationally televised address. As he outlined the new policies, he specifically mentioned the importance of input from frontline healthcare workers in developing reforms that would actually work in practice. Margaret watched the address from her new office in the West Wing, surrounded by colleagues who had initially been skeptical of her qualifications but now valued her insights as essential to their policy development process. Dr. Wright and Dr. Kim, her former teammates from the training program, had reached out to congratulate her on her appointment, acknowledging that her practical perspective had been exactly what the policy development process needed. But the most meaningful moment came when Margaret received a call from a nurse in rural Montana, the same nurse whose letter the president had shown her during their first meeting. "Miss Chan, I just wanted to thank you," the nurse said. "I heard that you were involved in developing the new healthcare policies, and I can already see how much thought went into making sure they'll actually work in places like our hospital." As Margaret hung up the phone, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The ordinary woman who had been mocked for her presumption in applying to a federal program had become one of the most influential healthcare voices in the country. Her story became an inspiration to healthcare workers across the nation, proving that expertise comes in many forms and that sometimes the most valuable insights come from the people who work on the front lines every day. Margaret Chen had transformed from a dismissed night shift nurse into a senior advisor who helped shape healthcare policy for millions of Americans. The mockers had been silenced by results they couldn't dispute. The ordinary woman had achieved something extraordinary, not by abandoning her background in practical healthcare, but by recognizing that her experience was exactly what the country needed. In the end, Margaret learned that being ordinary was never about having small impact, it was about having the courage to let your unique perspective change the world.